peeps, welcome to another video. Today is part one of the 5-part series of making this jacket, which is the new look 6080 pattern, and I've gone for the long sleeved version and I have also lined it. So the pattern is actually an unlined jacket and the instructions for doing that are very good. However, I know the type of things that I would want to wear a little jacket like this over, mostly being jumpers like I am now, and I know that I would want a slippery lining on at least the sleeves, so I decided to actually go ahead and line the whole thing. So I'm going to be talking you through how to alter the pattern to do that, how to sew the pattern, and some tips and tricks that I have for finishing off your jacket along the way. Now, I like this jacket so much that I made it twice. Yep, I made another one. Now, I made the second one because whilst I was making the first one, as I say, I was making up the lining process as I went along, and there were a few things that occurred to me as I was going that would be even better ways of doing something that I would either have to have unpicked some stuff, or I would have had to start from scratch. So I bought this fabric from Montreux Fabrics from the Festival of Quilts earlier this year in August, and I always intended to make some kind of a sort of jacket with it, and I am so pleased that I chose this one. I love the shape of this jacket. It works really well with the kind of clothing that I like, which is generally very high-waisted or sitting on natural waist, nipped in at the middle kind of clothing, because it hits right at that point on me and it looks great. So yeah, I'm really pleased with this one as well. Enough waffle, let's get to the sewing. So for the first part, we're going to be determining what size we need to trace, tracing the pattern off, and then making the alterations to the pattern, which will mean that we can line it. So let's get started. For this sew along, you're going to need your pattern, fabric, lining, bias binding, matching thread, pins, pencil, French curve, scissors, interfacing. You're also going to need a sewing machine and some pattern making paper. And I'm going to make the joke again, they're both too big to put on this table. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is make a list of the pattern pieces that we're going to need. And I'm making jacket A, so I'm going to need everything that's got an A next to it. So that's pattern pieces 1 through 9. And 9 will just be tracing the longer sleeve version as opposed to the shorter sleeve version. So if you're making view B, you need all the same pieces. Then, looking at the envelope for the measurements, for my bust I would be a size 16, and for my waist I'd be a size 14. However, so I've written those down there. However, if you look at the finished garment measurements, which are printed on pattern piece number 2, and they only have it for the bust because this is a fairly short jacket, it says here that total ease above body measurement is approximately 7.5 inches, and then they have here a description of what ease is, which I really like. Ease is the difference between the standard body measurements for a size as given on the envelope back and the finished garment measurements as printed on the pattern tissue. So for me, 7.5 inches of wearing ease is probably a little bit too much. I want this to be a fairly close-fitted jacket. I intend on wearing it over very slim-fitting jumpers, like the one that I'm wearing today. So very thin kind of jumpers. This is what I'm intending to wear this jacket with. So I think 7.5 inches of ease is excessive. So rather than do the size 16, I'm going to go down to the size 12. And this, instead of a 45.5 inch finished measurement, it gives me a 41.5 inch measurement, finished measurement for the bust. That means we're reducing the amount of ease we're using by 4 inches, so it's going to be a 3.5 inch amount of ease on the garment, which I think is going to be much better. So we now need to trace all of our pattern pieces. So what I like to do is, once I've traced them, I tick them off my list here. That way, hopefully, I won't miss anything. But not always the case. Ask me how I know. I'm going to get started. Okay, so I'm making a few changes to the pattern. For starters, it's unlined and I would like a lining. I just find those, I find it will give me a nice clean inside. It will also make it easier to take it on and off. So basically you need to cut out the same pattern piece of your fabric as you will for your lining for everything except the collar and the facings. So I have written on all of the facing pieces, one of the fabric and one of the interfacing, and then on all of the main body pieces cut 2 fabric and 2 lining. Now with the back piece we are going to be doing something slightly different because we need to give ourselves a little pleat here for some wiggle room on the inside, but I will show you that when I come to cut out the lining because in all honesty I kind of fudge it, so you know. Okay, so as I mentioned, this pattern is not lined, and it's actually quite clever the way that they've done the facing on this. So they have done the facing that goes around to the side seam, and then once you've sewn the facing on, you then sew the side seams together and with the facing unfolded, so that when you fold it back on itself, the back panel becomes kind of like a 1.5 inch hem, so this becomes its own facing. Now I want to line this and this method's not going to work for me, so I need to take the 1.5 inch hem that they've allowed off. So what I have done is I have drawn a line, and it happens to be the waistline on the back panel but also on the side back panel. I've drawn a line 1.5 inches up from the bottom, and that is going to be where our garment actually falls on us. So what we need to do from there is add in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so that it will match up with the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance that is allowed for on the side front panel. So effectively we're removing this facing piece from the back 2 panels. This 1.5 inch hem allowance off, reduce it to 5/8 of an inch so that it falls in line with the jacket, and then we can just do a continuous facing the whole way around with the lining. Hope that makes sense. Fingers crossed it will once I've actually done it and I can show you. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. This is the original pattern piece with nothing cut out of it as yet. Now the pattern says that there is a 1.5 inch hem allowance on the back for you to turn this up if you weren't lining it, but I want to line mine, so I need to remove that turn up and put in the regular 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So this line here is the 1.5 inch hem allowance that is included in the pattern, which if you fold that up, that would be the finished edge of your jacket back. So from that 1.5 inch hem allowance, I've then drawn another line 5/8 of an inch down, which is the seam allowance that this pattern is using, and I've drawn that line here. So we're going to cut this piece off. Now we also have the front facing and we need to draft a back facing. So the facing is 2 inches deep, and that includes a 5/8 of an inch hem allowance there. So we need to match up the 5/8 of an inch hem allowance here and draw a line 2 inches up, and that dashed line there is going to be the facing. So I'm going to do the same thing on the back piece. I'm going to find the 1.5 inch hem allowance. I'm going to draw in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance down from that hem allowance and then cut this piece off. And then from this bottom part here, I'm going to draw it up 2 inches and draw a dashed line. And as you can see, I've put in the seam allowances, so I'm going to match those over and temporarily tape that down so that I can then draft a single back facing piece. Right, lovely peeps, hopefully this will make sense. So we have got the pieces cut away, let's get them the right way around, from the bottom of our side back and our back. So as I said, the hem allowance on this is 1.5 inches, so I've marked that in. The hem allowance is going to be the finished edge of our jacket, so we need to add a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch, which is what is used with this pattern, back in. So I've drawn a line 5/8 of an inch down. I've then cut off the excess from both the back and the side back, and this ends up being 3/4 of an inch from the original bottom piece. I've then drawn in the seam allowance for the side back and the back facing, and I have lined up the stitching lines there, and I've just taped this down. Then we need to draft ourselves a back facing to go with our lining. So the facing piece is 2 inches wide, and so I've drawn a line 2 inches up from our new bottom edge here. Okay, so I've overlaid a piece of pattern making paper over the top, and I have drawn out our new back facing piece that's going to match in with our front facing piece. Now the thing we need to remember is that actually we're going to want to cut this on the fold, but the back piece here is seamed and has seam allowance in it. So we need to take off the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and just put in a cut on the fold line. So we need to cut all of that off, and that's our new back facing piece drafted. So I still want to add 1 inch of length to the back of my jacket, the side back and the side front of my jacket, and also to the sleeve. The sleeve already has a lengthened and shortened line on it, the bodice pieces don't. I'm going to use that line that I've drawn in to trace my facing, new facing. I'm going to use that as my lengthened and shortened line, so I'm going to add an inch there, an inch there. So I'm going to make the changes to these 3 pattern pieces, and I'm then going to work out if I need to make a change to my front facing. Okay, so if you want to lengthen a pattern piece, you're first going to need your pattern piece with your lengthened and shortened lines on it. I want to lengthen mine by 1 inch, so I've drawn 2 parallel lines 1 inch apart from each other. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you have a perpendicular line running through your lengthened and shortened lines on your pattern. Then you're going to cut along your lengthened and shortened line. Once you've completely separated it, you're going to need to stick it down. And I'm going to stick this to the bottom of the 1 inch box, or 1 inch rectangle I should say, that I have drawn. That's nice and flat. Now I'm going to take my French curve, I'm going to use a straight edge, and I'm going to line up what is essentially the grain line and just draw that line through, and that will help us perfectly match up the remaining piece that we need to stick down. So I've got my perpendicular line there, there and there, so I'm going to make sure they all match up and stick that down. And then once you've done that, the next thing you need to do is true up your side seams. So there's a little bit of a jog in the seam there, so I'm going to use my French curve again and draw a line like that, and then same there. Once you've drawn those lines in, then cut it out, and you've lengthened your pattern piece by 1 inch. The same principle goes if you want to shorten your pattern piece. What you would need to do in that case would be cut through this line, draw a line underneath it 1 inch lower, and then take this piece and move it down so that it was touching the inch line, so you've removed 1 inch of length, and again true up the sides. So it's the same process, just in reverse. So I've used exactly the same method that I've just shown you to lengthen the back and the side back pieces by 1 inch. So they're all done now. I'm going to take those away. The side front and the front piece, I actually did end up lengthening the front piece by 1 inch as well. I started by trying to do it here, and it just made it too complicated to try and sort out this particular curved edge. So I wanted to maintain this shape because it made it easier for the facing as well. So I went just above the notch and I put in my lengthened and shortened line there and lengthened it by 1 inch. I then did the same over here. So with this side, I actually decided to do it just above the curve in the jacket, so I have lengthened it there. And then I took my facing piece and I lined everything up along the top so that this edge was all lined up, and then drew on the same lengthened and shortened line that I'd used for this piece and added 1 inch in there. And then I've kind of rounded out this corner. I'm probably going to round it out a little bit more because it is a little bit pointy. So if I just kind of round it out like this, and then as long as I trim the same off of both just to get rid of that little bump, then as long as you do the same to both the front piece and the facing piece, it won't matter what you do as long as it's the same. So now all my pieces are altered, so I can cut out my fabric. So I literally used the end of my French curve to get a nice curve on that, and I've just trimmed off those extra pointy bits there. So now we can cut out the fabric. So I managed to get the entire jacket cut out of the leftover fabric from my 3/4 circle skirt, but I did have to cut the collars with a seam allowance. I didn't have enough to cut them on the fold, so I'm now cutting out my interfacing, and I just wanted to point out that although I've cut my collar with a seam allowance, I am cutting the interfacing on a fold. So I'm going to sew these together and then press it open and then interface the collar pieces, so just reducing the bulk in that area. It's quite a busy print. I think I'm going to get away with it, and besides it's going to be behind my head, so I won't be able to see it. Okay, so as I mentioned, this jacket, it does come unlined, but I am going to line mine. So we have made some alterations to our pattern pieces already to take that into account. The next thing that I'm going to do is cut out my lining. Now, I have got my back piece here, and I have centered it so that it's kind of equidistant away from the folded edge, and I'm actually going to cut it out on the fold. And I've also made a mark at the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance there, and 5/8 of an inch to the seam allowance at the top end, which is off our camera, but I mean it's 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to just clip into those little bits there and then make a pleat, because you want to have some wiggle room with your linings, so that when you when you put your jacket on and off, there is more volume of lining so that you can move around in it, as it were. I mean, basically the way I'm going to be lining mine is pretty much the same as interlining, but the that you won't see any of the seam allowance, so you know, it's kind of a hybrid between the two. So other than this modification, I'm cutting out all the rest of my pattern pieces out exactly the same. But the only other mod that I'm going to make is when I sew my sleeve, I'm going to use 3/8 of an inch for the sleeve cap rather than 5/8 of an inch seam allowance around there. And again, that will just give me a little bit of extra wiggle room in the sleeve. And that was something I read somewhere, and I can't remember off the top of my head where it is. But as I said, the only thing I really wanted to show you was that I'm going to cut the back piece out on the fold to give me a pleat, which will give me some wearing wiggle room ease on the inside. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I will do my very best to answer them for you. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!